21 miles. That is the width, most important stretch of water on Earth. Narrowest, not the widest ocean, not the deep. 21 miles, shallow, heavily patrolled saltwater. All peninsula called Moose. One country has threatened to close it roughly 12 times. Here is what nobody puts in the Iran never actually cost the global economy. Threat alone done most of. By the time you finish this, you'll under exactly why terrifying why the entire modern world basically one bad Tuesday away. Picture the Persian Gulf, long, narrow body of water, looks on a map like pressed inside of the one shore, Iran, proud, oil-rich, currently or exported his other shore, Gulf state, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, some of the wealthiest nation per capita, sitting on 40 to all of that oil, all of those enormous floating buildings stuffed with petroleum, all have to leave way out Strait of Hormuz. There is no back door, no service, and if you are a barrel of Saudi crude or refinery South Korea, go through the Strait of Hormuz. You are Qatari liquid natural gas heading to a power plant, go through the or Emirati oil heading to Europe, guessed it, Strait of Hormuz. 17 barrels of oil pass through. Put that in terms, stacked them on top of each other, would build a tower that roughly 21,000 miles. That 17 barrels represent approximately all the 1 in 5 barrels of oil in the gases. Hold that number as in a few minutes. Going to show you what happens fraction about your have never before. Strait of Hormuz shipping likely ships you very large crew about a quarter of a mile long, moving mile wide lane. Anyone ever wanted to maximum possible take directly did not do flanked by Iranian coastline or passage. Now here is where I need a subplot that runs underneath everything happening. Subplot most people have never, because we have been here, not metaphorically, in this body of 1980. Iran and Iraq, world's oil supply was already threading through both sides to sacking. Historians call it 1980 roughly 500 cracked tankers, cargo ships, passenger it floated, and eventually insurance rates by hundreds of shipping companies started to always do catastrophic all their lawyers, lobbyists, eventually keep that tanker war in the. I'm going to come back to it when I do parallels to what is happening. Going to. So why does Iran have so much answer? Both simple. Iran's coastline runs a liar Iranian revolutionary guard Iranian are all positioned striking every passing. Iran has decades investing in fast attack boats, water mines, shore-based radar, all optimized for life. And here is the thing: most people. Iran does not need to close the strait. Complete closure actually likely option. Iran physically blocked the United States and bond with over where international maritime law. Strait is waterway closure. Would here is the Johns not need close the just need dangerous go up. Shipping companies twice. Oil prices. Mine spotted here. Fast boat harassing a drone buzzing a platform. None of it rises to level of an active. All of it raises cost and risk. Control the geography threat indefinitely. Have a lever you pull and out having to. This is what strategists call the threat already baked in price of oil. You are somewhere between $2 $5. Not the cost of is the cost of geopolitical. You are paying geopolitical have been for nobody told. Yep, you heard that right. Now I want to show you the actual what happens. Chain reaction faster or total. Most people. Let me walk you through. Strait of Hormuz has two shipping exactly 2 miles. Very large crude carrier, quarter-mile long. Navigate 21 miles by Iran. This system was designed with maximum vulnerable tanker war of the between 1904 and roughly 500 cracked. Insurance rates for ships entering the Gulf went up by hundreds of shipping companies called their lawyers, lobbyists. Eventually, Iran's coastline runs along the entire Navy, Revolutionary Guard, batteries, all within. Iran has invested in fast attack boat, water mine, submarine, shore-based, all optimized. Iran does not need to close the fleet closure. Likely, Iran blocked it. U.S. would justify your Strait of Hormuz country complete closure with coalition. But here is the do not need to close the just make it feel dangerous. Shipping companies, oil prices, mine spotted here, gas boat, her own. None of it rises. All of it cost of this is the cost of geopolitical dollars and $5. Not the cost of the. You are paying for geopolitical anxiety every time you pump gas. Have been for nobody told. Day one of in hours. Oil futures markets work and traders do not wait. Trade on the oil prices start climbing 10 to 15 per hour. 15 global commodity food prices, airline shipping costs for all linked to the option of countries that feel it fastest. South Korea and imports roughly 87 per rate gets disrupted for not having an South Korea runs China, world's largest. United States thanks to American commodities. Here is the oil is a global disruption sends global crude prices. American regardless of market does not care. In 2019, after tanker attacks in the Gulf of Oman at Iran, oil prices spiked by approximately 15 ships did not sink. Nobody died. That is the power of the. Do not need to cause a catastrophe. Just need to remind. There is a question that never gets asked in the list. Everyone asks whether everyone asks how the U. Nobody asks who has the obvious and U.S. Fifth Fleet. U.S. spends approximately dollars. China imports more oil. China's economic critical chunk of that energy. China has virtually no military, no real ability. China is entirely that is a geopolitical dominant country. This is the situation, not just the broader vulnerable. Americans call it the Makkah. But the Hormuz dimension, arguably even more dangerous, because the threat environment so much. That brings us back to the anchor. The 19 U.S. law operation, largest convoy operation, escorting reflagged. But here's a twist: conventional almost always. China imports more oil, Hormuz, more than Japan, more than South Korea, more than China's economic manufacturing base, structure build out that hundreds of rural poverty, global all of it runs on a critical chunk of that goes 1 miles. No real ability. China has built the has aircraft carrier, has blue water, and but in the Strait of Hormuz right now, today, China is almost entirely that is a geopolitical, almost comical for a country policy. This is the situation that Chinese, not just the Strait of Hormuz, although the strait is most acute. The broader vulnerability of eruption by a rower. The Americans call it the Malacca dilemma, referring to another major point. But the Hormuz dimension of it is arguably even as the threat environment so much. That brings me back to the because here is where the historical the 19 Iran and Iraq were blowing up. United States eventually decided no choice. Kuwaiti government watching its tankers get attacked approached both the Soviet Union eventually said except with superpower offered. Soviets were the Americans immediately got 1997 United States operation the largest convoy operation. US American warships ordered lagged 3,600 miles. US military literally walking crossing guard walking across a worked roughly. Tankers got through. Oil kept, but it also involved US ships hitting Iranians. US warship accidentally shooting down an alien airliner, killing 209 constant low-grade naval conflict never quite escalated in all-out war, but also never quite went. Cost in blood and money, diplomatic capital was when it was over. Fundamental problem. Iran's ability to threaten shipping had been maintained temporarily. The geography had not changed. Enmity had not changed. Choke point remarkably vulnerable. Always. Here is what nobody was saying after operation. The United States had just demonstrated enormous keeping a shipping primary benefit. Iran was buying the oil. Europe was buying the economics of it were, put it politely, bit lopsided. American taxpayers funding and heading mostly that dynamic. America providing the global was owned in now United States. Failed revolution having dramatically worked to question of whether Washington lost in one of the more genuine questions. Let me give you the estimates of the total economic cost of securing the Strait of Hormuz, factoring in the U.S. military presence, cost to shipping company, insurance, Brett premium embedded in global oil, run to somewhere in the range $50 every $80 billion, act a 21 miles. That is more than the entire gross domestic product. Is the price the world pays. Global economy is a price that, regardless of whether you know about it, regardless of whether you voted for it, regardless of whether it is baked, is the silent tax that's cost. This is where the loss frame is. What most people not realize. Vulnerable is not something though that certainly is not something solved by posture. Is a fundamental structural global design or being generous around the assumption Gulf state always that assumption 50 every year it holds. Also another year the world fails to diversify. Here's where I want to walk you through just expensive, incomplete politically, which is basically the description. Every serious Saudi Arabia has a pipeline runs across the Saudi desert Gulf Coast all the way to the move approximately 5 million. That sounds like a lot, and but remember 17 barrels though pipeline covers roughly 30% total fuming operated. Here is where the central metaphor of our gilded thread begins to single shimmering gold that barrel priced every time tensions rise, every time that thread tightens, pulling the global closer. Thread is threat always. Now let me walk you through actual happens as the chain reaction is faster. Total day one of, let us say, Iran see a mine, nothing catastrophic just within hours oil markets work and traders do not wait oil to actually stop flow. Trade on the dictation. Oil prices start climbing. Bad day, you can see 10-15 jump. Crude prices 24 hours 15% on a global commodity that pins basically every other price in the food prices, airline tickets, shipping costs for literally every manufactured, all of it linked directly or indirectly, price of linked directly to the perception of risk. 21-mile stretch of water on the other side of the countries that feel it fastest are the ones most dependent. Gulf oil, Japan, South Korea, China. These are the economies running the most. Japan imports roughly 7% of its oil. Strait of Hormuz. You are running the Japanese economy. Strait gets disrupted for 2 weeks. You are not having a bad quarter. You are having an South Korea runs similar. China, world's largest importer of crude, gets a massive share of its supply through every single one of those countries. Every one of them has contingency. Every one of them main petroleum, specifically because of the United States in a different position thanks to the shale revolution. Fracking. The U.S. is now one of the world's largest. American consumers are not as directly exposed to Strait of Hormuz disruption. Here is the catch. Is the kind of catch that oil is is priced globally. If a disruption in the strait sends global crude prices up by 30%, American consumers pay 30% more for gasoline regardless of what was. Market does not care about your domestic production. Market cares about global supply, and the moment either one of those gets threatened, everyone pays. Let me introduce you to a number that I think about a lot. 2019, after a tanker attacks in the Gulf of Oman, oil prices spiked by approximately 15%. The attacks involved limpet mines, magnetic mines attached to the hull of a ship by ships did not sink. Nobody died. Physical damage relatively, but the signal, the message being sent about the willingness, capability to received loud and clear by every oil trade finance. That is the power of the choke point. You do not need to cause a catastrophe. Just need to remind everyone. Stay with me because this next part is one that actually how you sire. There is a question that never gets asked in breathless coverage. Strait of Hormuz. Everyone asks whether Iran would close it. Everyone asks how the U.S. would. Nobody asks the question actually important one. Who has the most to late gets? Is it actually the obvious answer? United States and Western buy the oil, run the global financial. They have built their entire post-World War II security architecture, keeping the shipping. U.S. Fifth Fleet is based in Manama, Bahrain, sitting right there in the Gulf. Specifically, project force and error exactly. Here is the twist. Conventional narrative always missed. China imports more oil, Strait of Hormuz, more than Japan, more than South Korea, more than in China's economic miracle. Manufacturing base, export machine, all of it runs on energy. A critical chunk of that energy flows through 21 miles of water. China has virtually no military. China has built the world's second largest NAS aircraft carrier, but in the Strait of Hormuz, right now, today, China is almost entirely dependent. United States naping Strait of Hormuz is not a problem they solved. It is a problem. The cost of that man quietly by every person. Military spending, oil prices, diplomatic bandwidth, opportunity cost of the tension by this 121 miles. Every single one of us spent choke point decade out no back to where we started. 21 miles with an important stretch of water on a country that has threatened to close it 12 times. Never had to follow through and once like the benefits threat. Military alliance spent trillions of dollars to keep it open without solving the problem. A global economy that has known about this vulnerability. 50 yacht man. It's a situation by every not getting more. Tanker war never really intermission was longer. The first act. Question not whether the next act. The question is whether the audience figured out the or the curtain was the next act is already being stage is set for a showdown that golden thread of history pulling tight. Strait of Hormuz is not bad. This is the story of a 21-mile stretch of water that holds the global economy hostage. A threat that never needed carried out. It is a reminder that the most powerful weapons often the ones that get fired. The most dangerous geography, one that you want to understand how money works, have to understand choke points the world was built around. Strait of Hormuz is the most important choke point. 21-mile lesson, power, vulnerability, price of global. If you enjoyed this deep dive into hidden global economy, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications. There is a lot more where this, if you want want to understand the next choke point shape the world, stay tuned for the next episode of Gilded, because the gilded thread of history always pulling. Next twist is closer than you in the